Welcome, everyone, and thank you for sharing your evening with us this evening. We have some of our premier chiefs here. And, through the initial round of the new Confidant Tooth, we found that there's some nuances that we didn't expect. So we're going to turn it over to Guy, and Guy is going to speak with Mark and Pete Yeaman and Mina Paul and Dave Perkins, with the authority, of course, of Stuart Blumenthal and Ellis Hall in the background. And we're going to try to help you through some of the issues and nuances of the new tooth. So take it away.
Thank you, Harvey, and thank you all for your attention. We've had some interesting issues this Confidant season, as Harvey mentioned. It's interesting because there really are not a lot of different rules for Confidant. In fact, there's the only rule difference is there is no assignment process, and for the indirect pulp cap, it must be the last modification. It doesn't have the exception that the patient would have. Other than that, all the rules are the same. But we want to reinforce how that's applied so the exam will be uniform, it'll be smoother, and there has been some confusion among the teams on a variety of issues. The first one that we want to address is timelines. And there has been confusion. I think some of that is generated by the fact that with the Confidant exam, we do it uniformly. Everyone ends with perio. So it got confusing where people had timelines, deadlines that we have in the patient-based exam, which is based on what you're finishing with. It's not fixed. And on the patient-based exam, it's variable. You might be doing 1, 2, or 3 procedures, but the initial run, at least for the Confidant, we're always doing 3. So remember that the timeline deadlines are what you're going to finish with. If you're doing 3 procedures on the Confidant, and you're finishing with the perio-scaling portion, that means you need 45 minutes of scaling time to start that candidate. And that candidate must have that 45 minutes available, or they failed the previous procedure, even if they passed it by performance, because they would have violated the exam guideline if they went over the 7 hours to do the first 2 procedures. So that means that scaling has to begin by 4:15. That means the restoration should have been in to be graded by 4:15 because we console candidates that it takes 30 minutes to grade. So if we use our usual rubric, that means the preparation should have been in line to be graded an hour before that. So that's 2:45. And those are general guidelines. If you go past those guidelines, it's nearly impossible for a candidate to do 3 procedures, and then the timeline rules come into place. So it's pretty straightforward in the Confidant because we're ending the same way. So hopefully that will end some of that confusion. Another area has been modifications. And there have been, of course, far more modifications with the Confidant because unlike with the patient, they almost all require modifications. And there's multiple levels of confusion within the modification process that we want to go over. First of all, modifications should only be requested if you're going to go beyond the acceptable level into the sub-level or beyond. No modification is required under the sub-level. So for example, if you've only gone 0.5 millimeter beyond the DEJ on the anterior composite, and you ask for 0.5 millimeter modification, that's not required because 1 millimeter is well within the acceptable level. You can go to 1.5 millimeters. So modifications should not be entertained if they have not gone to the full extent to the acceptable level. And you have to keep in mind that every time you add modifications, you're adding that full measure of approval for further preparation. So that's issue number 1. If someone asks for a modification and they don't complete it, in other words, I asked to do 0.75 millimeter reduction and I do 0.1 millimeter and I turn it back in for another modification, not only should that modification be denied, but there is an examiner recording form penalty. And I'll read that to you because I want you to hear that exactly what the words are required. And that penalty states that the unsatisfactory completion of a modification accepted by examiners. So if they've done that and they haven't gone to that extent, they haven't done that reduction, that should be denied, because if you accumulate a 1/2 to 3/4 of a millimeter and you do that 3 times and they've only done 20% of each one, you've approved almost 5 millimeters of reduction, which makes almost anything they do acceptable, but inappropriate. There's a new modification that has popped up at some exams. Not clear why, but some candidates are asking not to prepare any further. So they're wording the modification that they do not want to deepen the axial wall or gingival floor or pulpal floor or one of the proximal walls because no more caries exists. Now, that's an inappropriate modification, and we're going to get into what the CFEs should be saying later and how the examiner should handle it, but it's an inappropriate modification because modifications are to extend. They are not to verify that they've completed the prep. So if that modification is submitted, it should not be even entertained. It should be withdrawn as an inappropriate modification because that would be teaching and verifying. Keep in mind that when these things happen, I'm asking for caries, for example, and there's not clinical justification. There's an examiner recording form penalty of request to remove caries without clinical justification. If there's no stain, there's no decalcification, there's no reason anybody would just believe it's caries, that should always generate an ERF for that request. There's another ERF if that happens multiple times. The final area of modification confusion is the 4 modification 100-point penalty from ADEX. If you read that carefully, it says 4 modifications denied without clinical justification. It's not any 4 modifications that are denied. So if you think the range is too large, or you believe that they've asked for the wrong location, or you believe it's not caries, it's stain, or it's sclerotic dentin, or they've used the wrong anatomical term, any of the myriad of things that could deny a modification, even that they haven't prepped to the acceptable level, that does not come under this 4 modification without clinical justification rule. It has to be without clinical justification. So I'm asked to remove caries in a perfectly clean prep, and I've done that in 4 different areas. So I think now I want to ask Dave and Mina to discuss some of the issues that have actually happened at exams and how we're going to handle this in the future.
Well, Guy, I think part of the way this should be handled is in what we tell the candidates at the Q&A. And I think that it's very important that candidates understand exactly what the penalties will be if they're asking for inappropriate amount or not completing it, a modification that was granted, et cetera. And what's happened at some of the sites is the captains, I think, have a tendency to look at it and kind of eyeball it as opposed to measuring. And I think that they definitely have to measure so that they can justify why they're saying yes or no. And that it will definitely be important if it comes back and they haven't completed the first modification, that you have a measurement the first time to know that they didn't go to the extent that they asked for. So I think those are the biggest issues and the biggest problems. I think that there are more modifications than ever. I think students are being prompted either by chat or faculty to tell them that this is how you are successful on the exam. And so it's created a situation where we're having many, many more modification requests, and a lot of them are inappropriate. And it puts the the captain's in a dilemma on whether to approve or deny. So I think that that's probably the answer is going to be to make sure that both the candidates know, and again, that the CFEs know when they read the modification request that it's written clearly and correctly before it goes back, and, you know, tell the candidates again that if it's not going to go into the sub level, they don't even need to make a modification. I don't know, Mina, you have anything else?
Yeah, so, you know, adding to that, I think for the Q&A, it's really important to discuss with the candidates, and as we've discussed here, it's one of the things we haven't sort of pointed out this year is the reasons that a modification request could be denied. And so if it is denied and the justification was Carrie's requested by the candidate, just because it's denied doesn't mean that Carrie's wasn't there. It could mean that there were other reasons why it was denied, and we need to review that in the Q&A with the candidates. Conversely, I think in the team meetings that we're having with our team, that is something to go over with the captains as well, that it's important that they measure when the modification requests do come in so that they're able to, instead of eyeballing it, like Dave said, be very clear as to whether the first modification that was requested, if this is a second one in the same area, was actually completed. And if it wasn't completed, then that ERF should be filed. And again, without collaboration, that the first captain should really make that decision based that it was not completed. Let the second captain make an independent decision, and then of course, the opportunity to file the ERF would come up.
You want to elaborate on how a captain should measure the reduction and then add in the previous mod request before they grant the next one to make sure it was completed?
Yes. So when the preparation comes in for a mod request, and if this is the second mod request, then from the original acceptable criteria, they should be adding what was requested and granted in the initial mod request. So theoretically, if you're talking about 1.5 from the DEJ to the axial wall, and they have requested a range of 0.5 to 1 in their first request, you're really at 2.5 is where you should be prior to agreeing to the second request. If they haven't even made it to 2, then they have not completed that first modification request, which means at that point, you could file an ERF for not completing that modification. And I think that's where the big confusion is coming up this year, especially because this is more of an unusual circumstance in that the requests are not being completed before they're filing in a second modification request. And as Dave mentioned, there is, it looks like because we're not used to measuring, we're doing eyeballing, but I think that now we just need to measure to be very clear that whether it's been, the first request was completed or not.
And I think we want to reemphasize what Mina just said. You need to measure. So if somebody has reduced it, the axial wall of 1.5 millimeters, they ask for 0.5 to 1. Until they get to 2.5 millimeters, no additional requests should be granted.
Right.
You've already granted that range. And whatever you grant after that gets added to that 2.5. So if they've only done 2 and you ask them for another, they ask for another 0.5 to 1, they can go to 3.5 with impunity, and that you would never grant a 1.5 millimeter modification extension. So it's critical to evaluate, did they complete the modification that they requested? And that will address a lot of the issues that we're having for the modification.
Right, and Guy, the only other thing I would add too is that the captain should be, they should have an understanding of what the sub criteria is. And if they measure it and it's not at the sub level yet, the candidates don't need to have a request in. So it could be denied just because they haven't reached the upper limit of what would be an acceptable prep or going into the sub. So, you know, again, to go to Mina's point too, is when you measure, it automatically should be at the limit of a sub. and then they're asking for a 0.5 millimeter or a millimeter beyond that. So if they're at the area that it's not even at the upper limit of an acceptable or the limit of a sub, that's a modification that doesn't need to be granted. And again, I think the CFEs need to communicate that when the candidate signs that it's at the acceptable level. I think, as Pete was saying earlier, they're just into the area that it's acceptable. And they know they're going to go beyond that, but they're still going to be within that range. They don't need to put it in. They don't need to waste the time. So I think captains need to be aware of what those limits are for the sub level, and anything before that, they just don't even have to grant.
And so to put that in practical terms, in the anterior composite, if a candidate is prepped a 0.5 millimeter beyond the DEJ and they ask for a 0.5 to 3/4 millimeter modification, that should be denied because they can go 1.5 millimeters without any modification.
Correct.
So that it's critical that we did that. But you brought up a very important point, Dave, and that is, CFEs play a vital role in eliminating the confusion and communicating to the candidates the process that they need to undertake. The candidates are going to be helped also to be told they don't need a modification unless they're going to get in the sub. Plus, there's other areas during the exam that has come up this year during the Competent that CFEs have a vital role in communicating to candidates the rules. So Pete, I know you want to address that. So would you talk about communication from CFEs to candidates?
Sure. I think one of the first things we want to have the CFEs do is to make sure they check the teeth, make sure they're not loose in the typodont before the candidates mount it. So maybe between that 7 and 8 o'clock time when the candidates get their typodont, the CFEs can walk around and then just check the teeth, the teeth that are for that day to make sure they're solid. And if not, they can be tightened before the candidate mounts the Competent. The other issue that we're really facing is sometimes some of these teeth fracture. And some of these teeth fractures are really relatively minimal or they're minor, where they may chip the gingival floor on the anterior or on the posterior tooth, or maybe even chip a little bit of the buccal lingual cusps on those posterior teeth as well. And the way to really handle that for that kind of a fracture is to have the candidate complete a modification request form to extend that particular area and send it to the express chair to have that looked at by the captains for approval. And then that would be incorporated into their preparation, because that's something that you would normally do for a patient anyway. Now, if we see a real extensive fracture, which we've seen a couple of times, particularly on the molar, I would suggest that at that point, the chief should be called over to take a look at it and make a determination as to what should be done in that situation. And more than likely, if we have a severe fracture, mesial distal type of fracture on the molar, the tooth will probably be replaced. But in many cases, a modification request takes care of the problem and the candidate can proceed and be successful with their restoration and complete it appropriately. The other thing that's been talked about is we really need to make sure the CFEs understand the modification request to the acceptable level, because I, for one, brought that up, that if it's only at the 0.5 millimeter stage inside the DEJ, that is acceptable, because the acceptable range goes to 1.5. So as Guy has mentioned and was mentioned by Mina and Dave, they really need to take it to the limit of the acceptable level. And that is something that the CFEs can check with the candidate when they fill out their form, their modification request form, to make sure they've gotten close to the acceptable level limit before they send in for a modification. And that's going to speed up the process for them, and it's going to minimize the number of times that the candidates are going to be requesting a modification. The one other point we want to make is if the CFEs see a modification request where the candidate is requesting to not extend an axial wall, a gingival floor, or any part of the preparation, that is not a modification request. Modification request is to extend the preparation either externally or internally. It's not to not extend. So that should not even be sent to the express chair. And I think the CFEs can counsel the candidate and say, no, that we can't do this. There's no reason to send a modification to not extend. The other issue is that we've had some problems with is the indirect pulp cap. And there seems to be quite a confusion with the candidates about when to ask for a pulp cap. And I think the CFEs can be very helpful in this regard if they just ask the candidate if there's carries remaining in the area that they want to do the pulp cap. And if there is no carries remaining, then that's not an indication for indirect pulp caps. And I think that also will maybe clear up some of the issues that we've had related to indirect pulp caps, and even to a certain extent to the request for a direct pulp cap in some of these situations. So I think all of these things, if we can clarify that with the CFEs during the team meeting, it would help quite a bit during the exam process.
Thanks, Pete. That brings us right to what Mark wants to talk about, and that is direct and indirect pulp caps and pulpal protection, because really throughout this process, that has been an issue, especially since we went to red pulps this year. Mark?
And Guy, before you go on, I'd like to comment to something that Pete said, because one of the exams I was at, number 8, became a class 4. They fractured off the incisal angle, and I didn't replace the tooth because they thought, like, if that were a patient, you need to restore the tooth. Well, unfortunately, when the candidate wrote their request for modifications, and then the captain, so the CFE's guidance on what to write probably wasn't as good as it could have been, because they never asked for a class 4 and never explained that that's what they were going to do. And the captains, because that wasn't asked for, didn't approve the lesion to be a class 4, meaning when it went in for grading, it failed because the incisal gingival was more than 5 millimeters and the mesial distal was beyond the acceptable levels because the tooth had fractured. And I think the candidate would have failed unjustly because the tooth fractured, and they're already going to have a much more difficult restoration to restore. So I think, again, the CFEs need to make sure that they tell the candidate that they have to request to make it a class 4, and that the captains need to grant that request, and so that the criteria comes up on the tablet, they won't be failed.
I'm sorry, just to add one more thing to the fracture piece that Pete brought up. These students are very sensitized this year about the chipping and the fracturing that's going on. And one of the ways that it can be addressed is that the CFE should ask the candidate, when the candidate reports that there's been a fracture, the CFE should really say, do you feel that you can smooth it out and incorporate it within the acceptable criteria that's listed? If the student says yes, because it's very small, then it's appropriate to continue. But if they say, no, I'm going to have to make this larger, I think at that point, it would be appropriate to ask for a modification request. So because there is a lot of small chipping that's going on, you don't want, we want to avoid having too many modification requests for things that aren't really going to matter as long as they're within the acceptable criteria. And I think this encourages the candidate to utilize that criteria and make a decision for themselves.
Great. Mark?
Thank you. I'm going to be leaning on the CFEs here also. It seems like a lot of this is coming right down on them. Regarding pulp caps, I'm sure the CFEs have seen more pulp caps in the past couple of weeks than they've probably seen in the past 3 years. So regarding indirect and direct pulp caps, first thing, if a candidate comes up to you and says, I've got an exposure, I want to do a direct pulp cap. First thing we were always taught at CFEs is just tell them, are you sure? Let them confirm that. And half the time they go back and they want to say, well, let me go look at it again. And sometimes they'll come back to you and say, no, it isn't, but it's close. So, let me do an indirect pulp cap again instead. And that's fine. Just number one, let them be sure. If they come requesting an indirect pulp cap, first of all, of course, remind them, okay, remember, this is going to be your final mod request. So if you're going to do that, this is going to be it. Also, if they say, yes, that is it, and your question then becomes, define indirect pulp cap, and they're going to tell you, I've got decay and it's just over the pulp and in no other areas. Fine, go ahead and write it up and let them do it. But having them define that is very important, for the CFEs to do that and not let them just run roughshod, thinking, oh, I see blushing, I have to have a pulp cap because, a lot of them are taught, okay, if you see blushing, you have to have a liner. Well, liners aren't required by 8X and we don't want to have them requesting liners or doing something like that for something that's not truly an indirect pulp cap.
Great. And just one more point. The pulp this year is pretty hardy. So if you're a captain and you're checking for an exposure, the reality is that hole may feel like rubber because this is a hard rubber, you'll bounce right off of it. It doesn't have the same quality of hole it had last year when they changed the composition of the pulp material this year. One of the things we also want to talk about is the fracturing that Pete talked about. Some of these fractures, especially on the molars, we had our subject matter experts try to reproduce that. They used hand instruments, but of course they know how to use them properly. And I can tell you that they weren't able to reproduce these fractures. They wouldn't be able to create them. That doesn't surprise me. This is one area I do know about. Fracturing teeth is something I did as a career move and probably did more in a day than hopefully than any restorative dentist ever did in a lifetime. Once you do that occlusal prep and the axial prep, if you do a buccolingual torquing, that the tooth is going to fracture. It would fracture, a natural tooth would fracture. And in addition, that they're preloading these sometimes with extreme forces when they use separating wedges. So that preloads it and almost predetermines it. So these are things we want to go over in the candidate Q&A, that they shouldn't be applying buccolingual forces. And when they wedge, don't use excessive force. Use the same type of force you would use on a tooth. The final area that you're going to encounter that are dilemmas are in the periodontal model, the scaling one, where the teeth actually fracture out totally, because when you add a scaler and you lever against it, it can fracture it. I'm going to ask Stuart to go over what the central office and Stuart and Ellis to tell us what they advise us to do. This is a problem with the model. This is not a problem with the candidate. So what's your advice for the people in the field?
Yeah, if the tooth comes out in the quadrant that is assigned or the tooth that is assigned, the candidate should place the tooth back in the quadrant and hold the tooth in position with the finger as the fulcrum while they're scaling that surface. They should also make a note on the progress form and have that signed by the CFE that the tooth came out during treatment, and that will be taken into account when grading those surfaces.
Okay. And unfortunately, this is an occurrence. You're probably going to see it every exam. It's just it's a manufacturing flaw of the mannequin, which is being corrected in the next iteration, but it's just not available yet. So we've gone over 6 areas of issues that have arisen during the exam process this year. One of the things that we're going to be developing and getting to you right away, hopefully by the end of this week, is a PowerPoint to use for the candidate Q&A. There's lots of communications that we would like all candidates to get. advising them about how modification processes should be done, direct and indirect pulp caps, and other issues. We want to make sure everyone gets the same message. So that can easily be done through your Zoom conference by just sharing your screen. You'll have that PowerPoint available. And that way, everyone will be giving the candidates a uniform message, and none of this will be skipped. So that is one thing that you will be getting shortly. Look for that in your portal on your Chiefs tab. And also these 6 areas that we talked about, we'll try to get you a summary sheet because these should be added to your gray area discussions for your Zoom conference. So although captains and chiefs are going to have to watch this video or the taping of this video, not all the examiners have to. So you will need to explain and go over these areas because it affects the CFEs and graders alike. Any closing comments from any of the chiefs before I turn this back over to Harvey?
My intake from the last 3 weeks has been that this is a very CFE heavy dependent exam. And so your CFEs will need all the support they can get, and certainly will need to be very well prepared to deal with the increased number of modifications and making sure that conversations about direct pulp caps, indirect pulp caps, certainly exfoliating teeth from the periodontal arches, et cetera. It seems it's a market, but it's true. There's a lot happening on the floor, and it really, in order to make it flow smoothly, the students do need a significant amount of time per student. So, as chiefs, we've been on the floor a lot to sort of support our CFEs. So it would be very helpful to really have a conversation with them to make sure they understand their roles and understand what they're going to be challenged with when they are on the floor.
Good point. Harvey.
I'd like to thank each one of the panelists who participated tonight. They've all worked very hard to make this exam as fair as possible and use the pointers that they've given you. They've come together and done a great job, and we appreciate everything that everybody's contributed tonight. Thank you, Guy.
And thank everybody, and good night, and have great exams.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you and good night.